So this is our first video slash speech kind of thing for government, and we were supposed to make a video, 4 to 5 minute video of a thing that you thought was interesting, or you thought was relevant, or just you want to talk about in Unit 1. And for the first chapter, what I thought was really interesting was how I guess our government was formed when they took a bunch of ideas from a bunch of different very famous philosophers like John Locke, Plato, and Aristotle, and kind of meshed their own ideas into one to make a really powerful government. And they created like the Constitution, saying like what people could do or what people couldn't do, and like how the United States government consists of those institutions, agencies, and elected political appointed officials who purpose maybe to write, enforce, or interpret laws and public policies. So that was part of like how they were they used for the Constitution, and they formed the government. So I thought that was really interesting in the first chapter. Okay, and then in chapter 4, which is kind of skipping a couple chapters, but I thought that was interesting how they started talking about the English laws that they had and how they were kind of trying to enforce their laws onto the people in America, and how they were using the right to trial of a jury and one's peers under the law of the land, and how there was like limits on governors the power of tax, so they taxed like the tea, and then they had the Boston Tea Party, which was one of the major things where the colonists dressed up as Indians and dumped a huge amount of tea into the Boston Harbor, which I have visited there before, and because they dumped all the tea because they didn't want to pay all the taxes. And I thought it was interesting how we were separating from them, from the English, but yet they were still trying to have power over us and trying to tax the America and trying to take over the rights and stuff like that. And they came up with a bunch of different laws that they thought we should use, but we ended up fighting against them. Or they had where you had to um, house military people or army people, and they could search your house if they thought something was wrong. So like they were very trying to enforce all the laws of theirs onto us, even though we were separate. So I thought that was very interesting how they lost power, but they were still trying to have power, even though we separated. In chapter 4, I feel like it also applies to chapter 6, because they also talk about how they had the Tea Act in 1773 and how they had the Boston Massacre, which was involved, and it killed about, I think, 5 colonists. So it wasn't a huge massacre, and it was all on them trying to rebel and trying to actually be free from the English colonies. And I thought it was really interesting because even though like we separated and we went off on our way and we went to a new world, how the English were still trying to have power over us and were killing and having a huge battle on trying to be separated, and they didn't want that. And how the colonists were very upset about the taxes, which came to saying no taxation without representation. And that's where they taxed the tea, or they had the Stamp Act, which they were taxing for the stamps and stuff like that. And I thought that was interesting how the people were definitely being like, oh, it's our rights. You shouldn't be involved in us. We're separate. We should have our own government, our ways, not yours. Go away. Like, don't help us. We don't want to pay your taxes and stuff like that. And that's how, like, it all started. And then we wanted natural rights, and that's like rights for the higher people and lower people, and the laws made by self-evident. So like it's your natural rights that you should have anyways. That shouldn't have be law or shouldn't laws be written down about it. Um, but yeah, so that was about chapter 6 and how um, they the English were or the British were being still overpowerative and trying to be in power even though we were trying to be separate. And those were just some things I thought that were interesting of Unit 1 in the first like 10 chapters or so. But I know there was a lot more information that I could have talked about, but I thought this was just kind of important because it was just the beginning, and I've known a bunch of these facts and information because of 5th grade. We went to Williamsburg, and I went to Boston, and went to all the sites, so I just thought it was interesting. But those are just some of the things in Unit 1 of government in the first textbook chapters.